2025 was supposed to be the big comeback year for theaters. After the pandemic, the strikes, and the streaming fallout, this was billed as the rebound year, the one where theatrical movies were going to matter again. But it hasn't gone as planned. Actually, these first 5 months have been disastrous for the box office. Here's proof. 15 movies that totally tanked. Makes you wonder if going to theaters is ever going back to how it used to be, or if those glory days are officially gone. There was a moment when Daisy Ridley looked ready to explode into mega stardom, thanks mostly to the Star Wars trilogy, where she played Rey. But Star Wars is pretty dead right now. There's supposedly a new Rey movie coming, but who knows? And Daisy's star power has kind of faded too. Cleaner stars Ridley alongside Clive Owen. It's an R-rated action thriller where some radical activists take over an energy company's gala in a skyscraper, trying to expose corruption. But things spin out when a psycho-extremist inside their group takes over, threatening to kill everybody. And it's up to Daisy Ridley, who's playing a former soldier now working as a window cleaner. Yeah, seriously, to rescue the hostages. Basically, it's Die Hard, but British with the usual strong, independent woman saves everyone's thing. To be fair, Ridley's actually pretty good here. Surprisingly nuanced and believable. But in America, the movie barely came out. Only 300 theaters, so nobody really noticed it. Critics said it was fine, 51% on Rotten Tomatoes. Ridley's solid performance and Martin Campbell's slick directing kept it watchable. But overall, it just borrowed way too much from better films. So, kind of forgettable. Budget was $25 million, and it made only $1.3 million back. I actually saw this one myself in a theater, and it's definitely bonkers in a good way. Especially this one insane fight scene with Josh Hartnett going completely nuts with a chainsaw. But no matter how much fun it was, realistically, this movie was never gonna succeed commercially. It made just $3.9 million against a $40 million budget. Plot's pretty simple. Disgraced ex-secret agent has one final shot at redemption, tracking down some mysterious asset known as the Ghost on a flight from Bangkok to San Francisco. But the plane's packed with assassins from everywhere, all trying to kill both of them. It's pure cheesy 90s style action. Hartnett even said in interviews it's from the company behind John Wick, and you can definitely see that influence in the over-the-top action scenes. But don't expect a real story here. There's barely anything. Basically just assassins versus drunk ex-agent on a plane. That said, Hartnett's actually really good. Rotten Tomatoes was pretty kind too, 77%. Vertical gave it a solid release, over 2,000 theaters, but they pulled it way too quickly after only 2 weeks. Word of mouth never got a chance, and that killed its momentum. This one's basically The Weeknd's vanity project. Even his huge fanbase couldn't save it. Made for $15 million, it bombed immediately, only earning $5.9 million. It was dumped on video on demand on June 6th, barely 3 weeks after hitting theaters. Reviews: absolute disaster. Rotten Tomatoes, 15%. Metacritic, 29. Critics straight up called it sloppy, half-baked trash and a self-indulgent mess. Jenna Ortega, who's co-starring, probably isn't too happy right now. Part of this hate might just be backlash. Lots of people already dislike The Weeknd, especially after that mess called The Idol on HBO. Officially, it's some kind of psychological thriller. Weeknd plays an insomniac musician who meets a weird stranger, sending him on a mind-bending journey. But it sat in post-production for almost 2 years, couldn't find anyone to distribute it until finally Lionsgate jumped in last November, which was clearly a mistake. Another Lionsgate bomb, and trust me, there's more coming from them. Originally, Rachel Zegler almost got Jenna Ortega's role. Imagine combining the internet's Weeknd hate with Zegler hate. This thing would have imploded instantly. Joe Carnahan has made decent stuff before. Nothing legendary, but The A-Team was fun, and Smokin' Aces was alright if you didn't think about it too hard. But his latest, Shadow Force, is a straight-up dud. Stars Kerry Washington and Omar Sy as former leaders of some elite special ops team. They broke the rules by falling in love, went into hiding to protect their kid, and now their old teammates are hunting them down. So yeah, pretty generic plot. Critics weren't impressed either, just 33% on Rotten Tomatoes. Lionsgate put $40 million into this thing, and it's hard to understand why. Critics said it felt made for streaming, totally forgettable. The studio kept it from reviewers till the last minute. Probably a bad move, though advanced screenings might not have saved it anyway. Lionsgate's usually solid with these meat and potatoes action films, but Shadow Force tanked hard. People asked why similar movies with Wahlberg, Statham, or Butler succeed, and this one flopped. Easy. Those guys bring audiences. Unfortunately, Kerry Washington and Omar Sy just don't have that same pull. International sales got back about 2/3 of the money, but Lionsgate's still looking at a $10 million loss. Marvel hyped Thunderbolts as the big turning point after a string of mediocre post-Endgame movies. A darker, morally gray ensemble piece. Kinda indie, kinda edgy, with A24 vibes and Florence Pugh leading a crew of anti-heroes. But here's the problem. Nobody really cared enough about these characters. The break-even point was ridiculously high, around $500 million, apparently. Marvel dumped $180 million into this thing. Still hard to figure out exactly where all that went. And while it's earned around $370 million globally, sounds decent at first, that's actually a disaster financially. Looks like Thunderbolts will lose at least $100 million for Disney. Might not even make it past the $400 million mark worldwide. To be fair, it hasn't flopped as badly as the Marvels. That one's still Marvel's all-time lowest-grossing film at around $205 million globally. But Thunderbolts is now officially their second worst performer ever. Even Eternals did better, and everyone hated that one. Alright, here's a weird one. Juliet and Romeo. I don't even know what they were thinking here. You look at this and you think it belongs on Netflix. But somehow, this ended up actually running in theaters, like 1,000 of them, for maybe a week, week and a half. Of course, it didn't even crack $500,000 at the box office, and this thing cost somewhere between 15 to 20 million bucks. A modern musical version of Romeo and Juliet set at the end of the medieval period, replacing Shakespeare's verses with pop music. Honestly, the idea sounds a bit ambitious on paper. They even got decent names like Jason Isaacs, Rupert Graves, Rebel Wilson, and they shot it right in Verona, Italy, the actual city from Shakespeare's play. But when people actually saw it, it went straight downhill. Critics destroyed this movie. Variety called it poorly executed and said it had 0 catchy songs, basically calling it a wannabe La La Land. So yeah, this was ambitious, sure, but also totally unnecessary. Nobody asked for it, nobody wanted it, and predictably, it bombed. Another year, another Paul Anderson flop. Seriously, the guy's track record outside of Resident Evil movies is like straight up cursed. Think about it. Death Race, Three Musketeers, Pompeii, Monster Hunter, all bombs. So, no surprise, same thing happened again with his new one, In the Lost Lands. Ever heard of it? Exactly. This is based on a George Martin short story, which is the only reason I even noticed it came out. Basically, you have Mila Jovovich playing a witch and Dave Bautista as a hunter, and they go on this mission into this dangerous place looking for a magical artifact. Classic fantasy stuff. The twist here is tons of digital actors, way more CGI than actual humans on screen. Anderson bragged about this technical achievement, but audiences clearly couldn't care less. It was stuck in development hell for ages. Even Keanu Reeves and Nicolas Cage were considered at some point. Finally hits theaters with basically 0 marketing. Canada literally decided to skip releasing it entirely. Ticket sites like Fandango actually started handing out free tickets. Not discounted, just straight up free. And still, nobody went. Budget was around $55 million, and it made just $3 million at the box office. Total joke. People who did see it described it as ridiculous, a monstrosity of a fairy tale film. But here's the weirdest part. George Martin himself actually liked it. Anderson personally screened it at Martin's private theater in New Mexico, and he said afterwards he was sweating bullets waiting for the reaction. According to Anderson, Martin loved it, told him he captured his writing voice better than any adaptation before. Anderson joked later about his movies flopping first and becoming cult favorites decades later, but honestly, I'm not so sure this one's ever getting there. David Cronenberg used to be a pretty big name. Now Now he's basically making movies almost nobody sees, like the Shrouds. This one actually had a really intriguing setup. Vincent Cassel plays this businessman and widower who invents a machine that lets you communicate with the dead through burial shrouds. Diane Kruger, Guy Pearce, solid cast all around. But even with Cronenberg's name attached, it only got a limited theatrical run, came out stateside in April, nearly a year after it premiered at Cannes, and it completely tanked. The budget was around 12 to 15 million, but it couldn't even hit 1 million at the box office. Cronenberg himself sounds a bit burnt out lately. In an interview from April, he talked about how hard it's become getting anything financed that's even slightly unconventional. He mentioned the budget for his previous movie, Crimes of the Future, was literally twice what he got for the Shrouds. In another interview with the LA Times, Cronenberg pretty bluntly said this could end up being his final movie. His health's fine, apparently, but now he's thinking about switching back to novels instead of movies. This was Bong Joon-ho's big blank check movie after winning Best Picture with Parasite. A huge, expensive, totally weird sci-fi flick with Robert Pattinson, based on a niche novel and rated R. The problem was obvious from the start. It cost around $120 million bucks, way too much for something with such limited mainstream appeal. Pattinson and Bong Joon-ho are respected, but they don't exactly guarantee huge box office numbers on their own. Plus, the whole concept wasn't something you could quickly pitch to casual viewers with just a trailer or a poster. And behind the scenes, things weren't smooth either. Bong Joon-ho reportedly battled Warner Brothers over the final cut, and the movie got delayed multiple times because of that. By the time it finally opened, 2.5 years had passed since filming wrapped. No wonder the buzz was almost totally negative due to constant reports of troubled post-production. Reviews were decent, but not great. Audiences gave it a middling B cinema score. Not terrible, but definitely not good enough to get mainstream crowds excited. No surprise, it didn't get anywhere close to the roughly $300 million it needed to make to break even. And Warner Brothers basically abandoned ship fast, dumping it on streaming just 18 days after the theatrical release. A24 actually gave this horror musical with John Malkovich a fairly wide release, but audiences just weren't having it. Basic setup. A young writer goes off to visit this famous pop star who vanished mysteriously 30 years ago. She finds herself surrounded by obsessive fans, intoxicated journalists, and eventually wrapped up in some creepy cult scenario. Sounds intriguing, but the actual execution? Not good. It starts promising with this tense, unsettling atmosphere, but then it just completely falls apart, ending up confusing and unsatisfying. Rotten Tomatoes reviews shredded it. 41% critics calling it a messy mashup of random ideas that never come together. Think Jonestown mixed with David Bowie and Prince, with a dash of Midsummer and Get Out, but without any of the cleverness or payoff. It's disappointing because visually, it's great. Cinematography's genuinely stunning, and some individual scenes hit really hard. But overall, it's basically a turd wrapped in gold foil. Not even John Malkovich could save it. You probably heard all about Disney's Snow White by now, the absolute disaster of the year. Disney needed this movie to hit around $800 million just to break even. But by the time this thing limped out of theaters, it hadn't even cracked $250 million worldwide. It got ugly fast. Disney threw their own lead actress, Rachel Zegler, straight under the bus. They needed somebody to blame, and unfortunately for her, she was right there. Truth is, the budget spiraled completely out of control. Originally supposed to cost around $180 million, but constant reshoots, rewrites, and controversies ballooned that number fast. The big one was Peter Dinklage. He raised a massive stink about using real actors playing dwarves. Honestly, he was pretty obnoxious about the whole thing. Disney panicked, replaced real actors with these CGI nightmares, and the whole project just went sideways. But here's the depressing part. Even though Snow White tanked spectacularly, we're not getting away from these remakes anytime soon. Because just a couple of weeks ago, Disney dropped their Lilo and Stitch live-action movie, and it blew past $500 million in just 10 days. So the remake train keeps rolling. This was supposed to be an easy win. A fun animated kids flick from Briarcliff Entertainment. Wide opening, about 1,500 theaters. And what did they get? Just $525,000. That's barely $350 per theater. Embarrassing numbers. Plot's pretty straightforward. A designer sneaker gets lost in New York and has to find his way home. Big name cast too. Anthony Mackie, Martin Lawrence, Lawrence Fishburne, and Briarcliff definitely marketed it to the right crowd. Ads were everywhere during NBA games and kid networks like Cartoon Network and Disney, but audiences didn't care. Why? Well, first off, it looked terrible. The animation honestly didn't meet theatrical standards. Rotten Tomatoes currently has it at 32%, so critics weren't impressed either. Mackie does his best, but the script itself is just weak. Plot barely hangs together. And realistically, movies like these usually aren't even about theaters anymore. Smaller studios often drop films like Sneaks in theaters for 2 weeks just to label them as theatrical releases, then bump up the price once they hit video on demand, which is exactly what they'll probably do here. This one was supposed to mark Barry Levinson's big comeback to studio filmmaking. Written by Nicholas Pileggi, the guy who literally wrote the book Goodfellas was based on, and starring Robert De Niro as not just one, but 2 mobsters at once. Domestically, the movie earned a pathetic $3.2 million its opening weekend. Internationally, it was even worse. Total global box office is sitting around $8.9 million, on a budget around $45 to $50 million. Critics piled on. Rotten Tomatoes gave it a weak 37%. CinemaScore audiences were a bit nicer, giving it a B, but that doesn't help much when your word of mouth is lukewarm at best. The double De Niro casting didn't help either. Critics called it unnecessary, distracting, basically a weird gimmick. Mob movies haven't exactly been hot lately either. Haven't really had a big hit in that genre for decades. Warner Brothers head David Zaslav personally greenlit this thing back in 2022 against some studio executives' better judgment. Even at the time, there were people at Warner Brothers openly questioning whether it belonged in theaters at all or if streaming was the way to go. Irwin Winkler, the movie's producer, is standing by it though. He still thinks it'll eventually find its audience on streaming, compared it to Goodfellas, which also didn't do huge business in theaters but exploded later on home video. Winkler straight up said, "I think the film is terrific. Over the years, Warner's will make some money on it." Goodfellas didn't do huge theatrically either, but it became massive on DVD. I see the Alto Knights having a similar long-term acceptance. Maybe he's optimistic, maybe he's deluded, but that's his take. Another A24 project here, family-friendly fantasy this time. Opened fairly wide, around 1,000 theaters. It's about a girl named Yuri from a remote village, taught from childhood to never go out at night because of creatures called the Ochi. She finds a lost baby Ochi and decides to reunite it with its family. Simple story, decent setup, and honestly, a solid cast. Willem Dafoe, Emily Watson. Plus, the Ochi creatures were practical effects, not CGI, which was genuinely cool. But nobody saw it. Just $3.5 million total off a $10 million budget. It's another disappointment for A24, especially after recent struggles like Opus and Death of a Unicorn. They're spreading themselves thin, slapping their brand on anything and everything, almost meaningless at this point. Seems they're trying to be the next Miramax, but today's film landscape doesn't really support that kind of studio anymore. It's a shame because critics gave it a pretty solid 76% on Rotten Tomatoes. Good world building, charming practical creatures, decent story, just wasn't enough to bring in audiences. Yet another flop from Briarcliff Entertainment, a survival thriller about army specialists stranded behind enemy lines in North Korea. They marketed it as based on a true story, which it wasn't, really. At most, it drew inspiration from real incidents involving soldiers around the Korean border. Director Steve Barnett and writer Dwayne Smith went all in trying to make military life feel realistic. They did tons of research on soldier communication and camaraderie, but that didn't save the movie. Critics ripped it apart. Rotten Tomatoes score is at 31%. Reviews called it dull, forgettable, with characters as thin as cardboard. The soldiers' decisions were more dumb than brave. Treat it purely as a B-level action flick, something you'd catch randomly streaming, and maybe it's passable. But as a theater-worthy war movie? Not even close.